Okay, so are we live, babe?
John? Yeah.
Babe. sorry. And
sure
we
thing,
are
babe.
live. Today we have, for your listening pleasure, we have, I told John to find maybe the only Platonist atheist around. And I said, we need some real philosophy on this channel. Let's get some real meat and potatoes, some solid intellect. So he dug up the best philosopher this side of Graham Oppie, in a way, kind of the new Graham Oppie. Graham Oppie is kind of like yesterday's philosopher. The best philosopher this side of Thomas Nagel. So welcome, everybody, please. Eric Steinhart, is that how you pronounce your last name?
Yeah.
Steinhart. So, Mr. Steinhart, welcome to the channel. You want to introduce yourself and tell us who you are and what you do?
Sure. I'm Eric Steinhart, and I am a professor of philosophy at William Patterson University in New Jersey. I work on all kinds of stuff, mostly nowadays philosophy of religion. So I'm a Platonist and an atheist, and that might seem like a strange combination. I can get weirder than that if you want, but...
Well, I'll tell you, okay, so how I found you originally, there's this guy, Randall Rouser, who mentioned on Twitter in passing, some atheists have really, really nuanced takes on religion in general. He said there's a Platonist atheist, for example. And I said, who is a Platonist atheist? I've never heard of such a thing. And then he gave a couple names, not you, but I looked it up on Google. I was like, okay, Platonic atheist. And you were the first name that popped up. And I was like, okay, interesting. And then I found the chat with you and Joe. And I was like, all right, that chat I thought was great with Joe Schmidt on Joe Schmidt's channel. So that's how you wound up here, because I was like, John, we got to get this guy on the channel and find out about this. So
yeah. All right. Yeah. I mean, I don't know if the Platonic atheists or atheistic Platonists you mentioned before, probably, sort of old school Iris Murdoch is probably, historically the most famous. But there's
that's good to know. Okay.
Yeah. Eric Wielenberg does, atheistic moral Platonism. He focuses more on ethics and morality than I do.
Right. He did a debate with, I think, William Lane Craig.
That's right. And I think William Lane Craig is kind of terrified of atheistic Platonism in ways that, the sort of physicalistic atheism, that stuff doesn't really bother theists very much.
Well, we'll go into that
Sure.
when you break it down for us. But as an origin story, did you have a becoming of an atheist, or were you always an atheist? Or did you start out as a Christian? What happened there? We'll just briefly give you background and then
Sure. Real quick. Yeah. I mean, I started out long ago in the horse and buggy days, and I mean that. So I'm from
quite literally on the Amish farm as an Amish.
Yeah, I'm from Lancaster County, Pennsylvania.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah. And, we are not Amish, but we're very close. And so, yes, I grew up on a farm in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. We are Pennsylvania Germans, right? Deutsch, not Dutch. And we have a very, very strange form of Christianity. It's actually debatable if you want to even call it Christian. Of course it is, but and we had magic.
Is it Quaker or is it
no? Oh no. Well, the Quakers are very close. This is a kind of radical pietism that comes out of a German guy, Jakob Böhme, and it's real strange stuff, So we practice magic, and it's not like the Puritans, Calvinists who thought, oh, magic is the devil and stuff. No. We got the stuff, man.
Wow.
We got the we got the grimoires and the charms, and we're painting furniture and
wow.
doing yeah.
So that's how you were raised, and then when did you start?
Yes.
You started pulling away from that, I guess. When you went to college, probably?
Well, a lot of the dominant religious culture in the United States, which is Calvinist puritanical Protestantism, it was always very alien to me. And certainly when I went to college at Penn State and was more exposed to that than I had been just kind of, even, Penn State got a lot of people who are not Pennsylvanian Germans. But I was like, well, wait a minute, the religion I grew up with was very different. And in many respects, that kind of Pennsylvania German religion has a lot of paganism in it. a lot of heathenism. And so, yeah, I mean, I just sort of slipped pretty naturally into atheism very early on. And it wasn't even that hard in the sense, because the kind of God that I knew from being a kid was not, the ordinary Protestant God anyway. So,
Right. So you were, yeah, because you were in the kind of like a weird sect of Christianity, so it was easy for you to,
right.
because it wasn't like people were trying to, bring you into a fold that you even recognized. So in some ways, I guess.
Yeah, right. I mean, that Burmian Christianity, if you want to even call it that, God is born from the self-negation of nothingness, through the mediation of a female, a divine female principle.
Wow.
Right? And there are plenty of Pennsylvania German sects that have not just a god, but also a goddess. The Virgin Sophia is a goddess. And so we got it all,
sure
man.
a lot of regular Christians would probably think that it doesn't even count. It's not kosher, or like.
Oh yeah, it's not Orthodox.
Right.
It's not Calvinist. It's not that stuff. Forget that stuff. Yeah.
So then you became a philosopher. Now, if first, why don't we tell people what Platonism is and how you define it, and then we'll try and figure out how you reconcile it to atheism and what you mean. Does that sound fair?
Yeah, sure. So, Platonism, I mean, to put it really quickly, right, Platonists believe that there are what's usually called abstract objects,
right.
Mathematical objects, for instance. So numbers, Platonists would say, look, numbers aren't ideas in people's heads. You can have an idea of the number one, but that's not the number one. The number one is a thing that exists, just like a rock or a tree exists, right? Or just like, a star exists.
I defined it as, on my videos, as ascribing reality to the transcendent realm. Is that a description you like?
Well, I probably wouldn't say transcendent.
No, I'll be hurt, but,
I mean,
okay.
Transcendence is a weird word. I mean, so a Platonist is going to say, look, the forms or the structures, right? Sort of abstract structures or mathematical structures, they're right here. They're right here. And like if you try to make a triangle out of wood, or steel or whatever, or even park your car, you're going to use the Pythagorean theorem.
Right.
It's not somewhere else. It's like right where your car is that you're trying to park, or right where those pieces of wood are that you're trying to cut. It guides you and determines what you can do and what you can't do. Right. Or if you try to take 3 pennies and arrange them, you're going to be restricted by mathematical laws. Those laws are there. The principles are right there. Right. And I think you mentioned Mark Tegmark, somebody like him just constantly points that out. The physical is the
how can you kind of, this might be asking a lot, but can you kind of summarize, because I've listened to a couple of Tegmark lectures, and can you kind of summarize his position? It's weird. It's like everything is mathematical structure as a totality. Is that how he's describing it? I'm not quite sure how to describe it.
You got it. I mean, everything is a mathematical structure. Right. And so, space and time, this is a mathematical structure. And, he's a physicist, he's a cosmologist, so you can get technical. We don't have to, but, like quantum fields are mathematical objects, Hilbert space, or, 4-dimensional Einsteinian space.
Now, Hilbert space is a pure mathematical abstraction, correct? Am I understanding that right?
But it's not an abstraction. It's just there.
Right.
You're living, you and I are in it right now. Right. I mean, it's not somewhere else. It's right. I'm in it.
Most physicists, or a big chunk of, well-known physicists, are Platonists, as far as my understanding. Most famously, probably Penrose, but there's others, right?
Oh, sure. I mean, once you start to get into that kind of really theoretical physics, it's called mathematical physics for a reason, right? You're just doing math, and you're just saying like, oh, this is the math that is us, that is our universe.
Right. This is the math that is the structure of reality. So they see no.
That's right.
And I think Penrose, or somebody I was listening to, I don't think it was you, may have been you, but somebody said when they go to investigate an axiom, they are discovering that mathematical relationship. They're not inventing it. So to them, it's like self-evident that Platonism is true. They're not creating that law or that relationship. They're discovering it.
That's right. But they're also saying, I mean, it's not quite self-evident, right? You have evidence for it, right? When
Well,
you,
I meant self-evident that they're discovering it, not creating it.
yes,
Like
right,
they're looking for it.
right. I mean, you see that it works because you're doing physics and you're just like, people say like, oh, there are material things like electrons. Well, what's an electron? I mean, you look and you say, well, an electron is a kind of warp or twist in a quantum field. And what's that? Well, it's like a function from space-time points to tensors. What are tensors? Well, they're, these mathematical objects. And so, a notion of material stuff, it's just not there.
Right. Now, the counter, the typical, the reason why I thought it was interesting is that most of your typical atheists, even today, are reductive materialists, correct? I mean, is that a fair summation? And how would you, and what is your interaction with them? Because I heard you mention something like, they tell you, like, where's your evidence for your Platonic forms? Just like they say to me, like, where's my evidence for God? Like,
yeah, well, look, where's the evidence for mathematical structures? Just open a physics book and look at the equations.
Right.
Right. I mean, that's a cheap shot, of course, but the effectiveness of mathematics and physics, the fact that, the deeper you go into physics, it's just mathematics. That's all that's there. Nobody ever says, oh, there's math, plus there are these things that are not mathematical. That's what motivates people like Tegmark and, a number of quite a few others. You look, there aren't other things. Right. And so, the evidence would come from physics. I mean, I read a lot of physics. I study a lot of physics. I love physics, and I love math. So, okay. And I'm often frustrated, like, yeah, sure. This body is a material thing. I don't have an immaterial mind. My mind is my material brain. It's a physical brain. That my shirt is physical. But really, that to me is kind of trivial. Like, what is physical? What is physics? What is physical reality? And I think everybody knows, like, okay, quantum physics is pretty weird, but it gets weirder. And I often find frustration with a lot of atheists who aren't aware of just how weird physics is. Right now, in fact, just recently, right, the second law of thermodynamics was derived purely mathematically from axioms of quantum information theory.
Right.
And that's not speculative. That was done, right? And that's amazing to me. That's an amazing result. It would be premature to say that everything is going to be derivable from quantum information theory. But if you can get the second law of thermodynamics, you're really close to getting gravity. And you're really close to deriving, right, the unification of quantum mechanics and general relativity from quantum information theory. That would be really weird. Because then what is physical reality? It's a network of entangled quantum bits of information.
Yeah, I just heard somebody who was doing a theory on that, who was actually presenting that. His name is Johann Ratz. He was presenting it as an argument for ideal. You know him?
I don't. I've heard the name. I don't know him. But yeah, some people are going to make an argument for a kind of idealism or panpsychism from that. I wouldn't do that. I just say information is information.
Right. But I think he was calling it entangled information. His argument was that space and time is emergent from entangled information.
Right.
He was saying that's a type of consciousness or proto-consciousness. So
right.
you agree with the first part. You just don't think it's consciousness? Or
I don't see any reason to say it's consciousness. I don't, that doesn't add anything to me. But it would be really striking. And I think maybe this will happen in my lifetime, almost certainly in yours. You're going to see another revolution in physics, and it's just going to be very different.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's going to be shockingly different.
So have you checked out the holographic principle? Are you on that page too?
Yeah. Oh yeah, sure.
That's all part of, I started checking that out.
Yeah. The ADS CFT correspondence, all that, it's all, these are all things that are starting to come together. I won't predict, I don't want to speculate about what the shape of that will ultimately look like, except to say that the shape of that is going to look extremely different than what most of us have taken for granted about physical reality.
Yeah,
It's still going
absolutely.
to be physical, right? I'm not going to, but yeah, if you can purely mathematically derive the second law of thermodynamics from axioms of quantum information theory, that might sound like somebody might say, like, geez, Steinhart, you're way out there. You've lost it. But that's a pretty impressive feat. So, yeah, I mean, I would like atheists, I think, to think more about physics, right? And I would like theists to think more about it too.
And when you talk about the forms, though, I didn't hear anything about like the typical what people think of when they think of the forms is the idealized version of justice stays out there in the realm of justice. Are you a Platonist in that sense too, or just the mathematical?
I think, yeah, I mean, I'm happy. I mean, if you get one, you kind of get the other for free. I mean, buy
Right.
one, get one free. I mean, but, I mean, this kind of I don't know, a textbooky kind of view of the forms, the form of the bunny, it's an ideal bunny. The form of the dog goes woof, woof,
Right.
cow goes moo. I mean, if we want to really be precise about the forms, someone like me, as well as a lot of other folks, like, Tegmark says, oh, they're just mathematical structures. Well, what's a structure? And other people say that too, right? Structuralism is a pretty widely held position these days. What's a structure? I'm going to say a structure is a set theoretic structure. So, ultimately, I'm going to appeal to pure set theory there.
Right.
And that's what the forms are. And, any structure that can be expressed in mathematical physics can ultimately be expressed in set theory. So there's a lot of people who have thought, I mean, like Rudy Rucker, is an old mathematical physicist who wrote about that stuff. And there's quite a few more. So, yeah, it's all there.
So how does this inform atheism? I mean, you've written articles on Platonic atheism and
Right.
a value structure too that is somewhat consistent with this.
Right.
You want to bring that in as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I mean, and I should have a book coming out on this sometime soon. But the general slogan, if you want it in just a sentence, is if you've got abstract objects, you don't need God. Right? Anything God could do or was thought to do is just done more directly and simply by the abstract objects themselves. And if you start to look around with William Lane Craig and some other folks, you see that this is a threatening position to them for a lot of reasons, right?
Because they can, as you said it to Joe Schmidt, they can not necessarily hand wave away, but they can deal with the reductive materialist naturalist, because that's like almost a stock figure and a stock set of axioms and arguments that are kind of not easily be debunked, but pretty easily debunked in terms of the philosophy, at least. It tends to reduce to something close to logical positivism. But
right.
yours is more nuanced. I would call it in between theism and atheism, but I'm not sure if you would call it that. Would you call it that?
Well, in some ways, it shares features with both. I mean, it is atheism. There's no God, nothing like an Abrahamic or Christian God. But there's the reason I think that's more threatening is that, theists and atheists both agree that like the physical world exists.
Right.
They're not
right, and we can do science through natural
right.
laws. Unless you're really out there
Yeah.
theist, you think you could do science, and yeah, right. And we do science according to methodological naturalism. So yeah.
Right. So it's not, but then theists will say things like, oh, materialistic atheists, you can't do morality. You can't talk about moral values or moral laws or principles. And like, as you mentioned earlier, okay, you can't talk about, transcendence or things like that, or you can't give an ultimate explanation for why is there something rather than nothing, or why does the physical universe exist at all? Why are there laws, et cetera, et cetera. But the Platonists can do all that. Right. The Platonists can say, oh, I believe in transcendence. The transcendent is the good. And you know what the good is? The good is an abstract object. It's not God. And now you got this thing, and it's actually hard right? And I can say things like, well, we've got moral principles, moral laws. I mentioned Eric Wielenberg again. He does more of that ethical side. But say I can say as a Platonist, I can say something like, the golden rule or the categorical imperative is an eternal necessary moral law, mind independent. There's objective morality. A Platonist can say all that, and that's going to be a real threat to theism.
But isn't my question is, because isn't that also a threat to the atheists, or not necessarily the atheists who are thinkers and philosophical, that like I always refer to them, but the typical goofball atheist on Twitter who will tell you that what you just said is fantasy, right? I mean, isn't it a threat to them as well? That's why I was trying to get that there's a nuance here. There's an in-between theism and atheism here. That's what I was, because I've been making these arguments on my channel in favor of theism, and my point has been that the point of a certain type of presuppositional argument is to get somebody to the point where you are somewhere in between atheism and theism, and it's philosophically robust and justifiable, but you are allowing for the reality of the transcendent realm or
Absolutely.
the abstract objects.
Right. And I think it is threatening to a lot of atheists. I mean, what's interesting, one of the things that is interesting to me is I often think that, and I didn't invent this. There's a whole bunch of sociologists and anthropologists who study atheism, and also some theologians who just study it. They're not going to try to,
like people,
right,
like the sociology.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. The social movement, what are its, how does it unfold? What are its strategies and arguments, and where? And
wow, that's really interesting. That'd be really interesting.
It's really interesting stuff. There's a guy, Fraser, a sociologist, anthropologist kind of guy. He's written a book about this, a bunch of articles. There are others, but he's probably the one standing out right now. But a dominant theme of all that literature is Anglophone atheism, right? Atheism in the English-speaking world is a kind of hyper-Protestantism. It's a kind of hyper-Puritanism that it's a theological, and a number of theologians have written sort of about this too, that it's actually a kind of, super.
It's a branch of fundamentalist Christianity. It's like the anti-branch. It's exactly, it's like almost it's opposite, but it's so similar in some ways because it's only reacting to fundamentalist Christianity a lot of the time.
But it's a little more nuanced than that, in the sense that fundamentalism, because I don't want to quite call it fundamentalist, but fundamentalism and atheism are branches from the same root,
right?
From a kind of, and they're both responses to a problem of idolatry. And so, atheists are, have taken like the Christian criticisms of idolatry to an extreme. And, this I think gets weird, but it gets interesting. This is one of the issues I have with Graham Oppie. I mean, I love the guy dearly. He's a brilliant mind, a brilliant and wonderful man. But I don't want to talk about God. Right.
You're on
other stuff.
You're on a different. One of the things that I've also started bringing up in videos I haven't brought out is coming up with the coherent theory of atheism if there were no Christians around. So I do a thought experiment. You're in the future and you've killed off Christianity. Now you're an atheist and they're all excited. But I'm like, now you have to come up with the coherent theory of atheism. How does the world give me a coherent philosophy, metaphysical a priori, all that stuff, and there's no God. And you still have transcendent objects and abstract objects.
Or whatever. But you're not going to be right. I don't think anyone has, somebody like, not quite Dawkins, but, Oppie has written an enormous amount about God. And it's a kind of negative theology, right? That's a great word for it. Go ahead. Yeah, this is not my observation. I'm not inventing this, right? There are lots of, especially these sociologists. And again, I don't mean to criticize Graham's work. His work is just ingenious, right? It's just the position an atheist like him takes is different than mine. Right. And he knows that. I think, right, let's stop writing about God. Let's stop talking about God. Let's figure out what we have to do next, right? Because as long as anyone's talking about God, you're keeping that alive, right? You're keeping it in people's minds. You're keeping that trend going. And it is interesting, and some of these people, theologians and others, have noted this. They're like, look, there is a stream in Christian thought where you really know apophatic theology, where you really say, look, God doesn't exist.
Like Paul Tillich? Or are you
Paul
talking about
Tillich, right? Paul Tillich, but there's a long tradition, right?
right.
That they say, I mean, Paul Tillich expressly says, in volume 1 of his systematic theology, he says, look, right, Protestants have made God into an almighty person, right? An almighty, king, ruler of the universe, this person in heaven, this Anselmian, unsurpassable, omniperfect,
Right.
deity. And Tillich says, atheism is right. That thing doesn't exist.
Right.
That's an idol. And so now you're like,
right. The man in the sky who's watching that's the idol.
Or, well, even the more abstract, like Anselmian, like omniperfect, unsurpassable, immaterial person.
Right.
It's an idol. And this is Paul Tillich who's saying this. He's a Christian theologian, right? So there's a long tradition of where and again, people have noticed this. It's like, well, wait, how do you distinguish Tillich from a lot of these other atheists? Right? Like, what's the difference? So, okay. I think that's a real, so from my point of view, I'd like to leave all that behind. I don't want to talk about God. I mean, I have to sometimes, of course, but I'm interested in developing other things, right?
Is other things kind of spiritual too, in a more watered down sense, or is that not in the program?
Watered down, man. We're like building stone circles and shit, man.
Oh God!
We have fires and like sigils, and we're doing the thing, man.
Is this an actual group that you're part of?
There are groups, right? There is, and I'm not. I mean, I know about all these things. I study them and write about them, but there are atheistic pagan groups. In fact, there are quite large.
That's a big atheo-pagan. What's his face? Who you mentioned it before we got on air? Did a video on that I thought was really interesting. Not Joe Schmid, but the other guy,
Micah Edmondson.
Micah. Yeah. So there are actual groups. It turns out there's quite a few. You have to poke around, but you'll start to find them. The atheo-paganism group that's kind of led by Mark Green. Thousands and thousands of people. They've got chapters all over the country. There's all kind of atheistic witchcraft, occult atheism, atheistic
right. Well, there's
magic.
the satanic atheists, and when you talk to the satanic atheists, they don't believe in Satan.
Right.
So it's like
they're atheists.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's definitely like it could definitely trend out. And what are they doing about the ritual? Do they think that? I mean, what I thought was interesting about Micah's video, if I remember it correctly, is ritual is an innate part of being a human. It's a part of like life. So you don't want to have something that gets rid of it. You want to give expression to it, but you don't believe in the metaphysical underpinnings of a church.
That's right. But you can start, Platonism, right? If you go back in the day, right, to the old Platonists like Plotinus and Iamblichus and people like that, they have elaborate systems of rituals. People often think, oh, these Platonists were just, sitting on their asses thinking about stuff, but they have elaborate practices, right? They do things. That line, especially as you advance from Plotinus to Iamblichus to Proclus and things like that.
Now, Plotinus is who everybody usually refers to as Neoplatonism, right? Am I getting that right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I don't like that term. A lot don't. That was actually kind of a Christian slur.
Right. Well, I
So
remember you meant referencing that he considered himself a Platonist. I think
yeah,
that's you who said that.
yeah,
So
yeah.
I
The
just thought that
term,
was interesting.
right. So that term was used as a kind of slur among Protestants who said that, oh, these other Protestants are Neoplatonists. And then it got transferred to Plotinus and those guys. They never thought
Right.
of
And it's
themselves
really
that
just
way.
the one. The one is the
Yeah.
it's the is the entity, I guess you would call it. What are we calling it? The one is the
Well, we're going to leave the one out of this for the moment. But yeah, these Platonists, right? They had ritual practices, they had symbolisms, all sorts of things you can do. And a lot of these contemporary uh, atheo-pagan kinds of groups are inspired by a lot of that, right? So they have rituals that celebrate, the solstices, the equinoxes, the cross-quarter days in between. They have all sorts of rituals for different life events, for all kinds of things, and all kinds of, for instance, observational practices of relating to nature, right? I've been kind of sucked into bird watching.
bird watch.
I never thought, I'm at a place now where there are dozens of species of birds, and that I can see and photograph. And older naturalists, American naturalists like John Burroughs, who was basically a pagan naturalist about 100 years ago, 120 years ago, kind of forgotten, unfortunately, right? But a lot of people in these groups, in these trends, say, look, you look at birds, or you go in the forest, they have meditative, contemplative exercises of observing and interacting with nature, and you start to learn about the patterns and structures in the natural world, and try to understand yourself in relation to them. And this builds into larger, metaphysical pictures and
Right.
views, right? Seeing the patterns in nature, looking at, in other words, it goes beyond, like, a lot of atheist witchcraft goes beyond, and witchcraft here doesn't mean the simple thing of, like, I don't know, mixing up some salt and lizards and, wishing for money or some stupid thing like that, right?
Right.
I mean, it is interesting how serious some of these people are, and how different it is from the stereotypes, right? So there are, some atheistic strands of witchcraft that are just all about just immersing yourself in the natural world and participating in it in certain ritual ways. Um, all these movements are actually to me, surprisingly large. You know,
Really? That's
yeah.
interesting.
I mean, it's under the radar in a lot of ways, but you don't have to go. Here's an interesting exercise. I mean, a lot of this is woo woo, of course, but you scratch the surface, you find other stuff. If you just
Right.
start looking on Google Maps all around the country, like, for metaphysical shops, like, I just decided, like, I was going to do this for Pennsylvania, near where I grew up, and I thought there aren't going to be any down there. It's even though it came from this weird, German, paganism or whatever. It's all just like Baptist fundamentalists now, or, and I thought there aren't going to be any. And my God, there's dozens.
Wow.
They're everywhere, yeah. So there's people doing these things. I don't want to portray this as just an abstract philosophy. The abstract philosophy, that the atheistic kind of Platonism that I'm developing, right, in many ways really feeds into lots of groups that are, actively engaged in trying to create new cultures, right? And they're not out there arguing that God doesn't exist, because they don't care.
Right. They're
Y-
not. They're not defining themselves in opposition to any type of Christianity or theology. They're trying to find what they are. They're trying to. Is that right? They're
Yeah,
trying to discover what they truly are. And it looks to me like you're trying to develop a coherent metaphysics and a coherent philosophy that is consistent with their abstract objects, their reality, and consistent with plus I don't believe in God. because normally abstract objects and belief in God kind of go hand in hand, or at least they're closely parallel. That's why I thought there'd be pushback from the atheist community.
There is, yeah, you're right to point to that pushback because, lots of them are like, oh, if you believe in the good, that's just God. And I'm like, no, it's not.
Right.
It's
Well,
just not.
because a lot of them, I talk about this a lot in my videos because I started noticing interacting. Most of the people online that we think of as atheists are really kind of logical positivists and scientismists.
Right.
And you can tell us what that means if you want to describe that.
Yeah, well, I mean, in a certain sense, scientism thinks, that any question that can be meaningfully asked can be answered by science.
Right, by empirical investigation.
Right, empirical investigation. And it's similar to logical positivism, right? So truth is just verification, right? Evidence. If there's no, and sometimes this is a little funny to me, but okay, because people would say this to me all the time in these kinds of online and other debates, like, well, if there's no evidence for something, then it's false.
Right, exactly.
And I would say,
we know that there are mathematical axioms. We know that they're not false, but they can't be empirically verified for. That's why I've latched onto that as the hinge to the forums, because that's the door to the Platonic. I'm calling it the Platonic realm. I'm take it you're not crazy about that.
That's fine.
Okay.
But I think that the point is when somebody says, to me, like, if there's no evidence for something, then it's false. I just ask, well, what's your evidence for that?
Right. Of course. Well, that's the rejoinder to the logical positivist when that which can't be empirically verified for it's not sensical. It's meaningless. Well, how are you empirically verifying for that statement? Well, I'm not.
The verification principle is self-refuting.
Right. Exactly.
And that's been known since 1936, man.
Right. And it's even acknowledged by the guy who founded logical positivism.
Right.
He's like, the main defect is that it's false.
It's self-contradictory.
Right.
And so, well, look, man, like if you want to be an atheist and committed to logic and reason, then maybe you got to rethink what you're saying there. And of course, Christians have observed this, right? And they just, Ed Fieser gave a brilliant review of Alex Rosenberg's, atheism book. He's just like, this book just refutes itself.
Right. And I think you said Hume had the first self-burning book, and you were referring to that was a great tagline, man.
Yeah, what? How do you go from that? So I just don't think that I would like atheists to be a little more sophisticated about that problem.
But they don't get it. They and then they also poo-poo philosophy. We just got into a debate yesterday with a guy for like 10 straight hours telling us that science is done with philosophy. That's where this all leads. It's like, we don't do metaphysics, we don't believe in abstract objects, and we don't do philosophy. Okay, well then you can't make sense of the world. That's the point.
Yeah, right? And who's this guy talking to? I hang out with physicists and scientists all the time.
Well, he was self-refuting even with the course of the conversation. Like I posted a Carlo Rovelli, why physics needs philosophy, his lecture on that.
And those guys, a lot of Rovelli and Lee Smolin, Tegmark, a lot of those guys really are pretty well. Some of them are not. But the guys I mentioned are pretty well versed in philosophy.
Yeah. Well, Rovelli made a conscious choice to try, because he thought he needed to understand. In order to really understand what's going on with quantum mechanics, he had to start studying philosophy to train himself to perceive differently about the nature of reality.
Right.
And I think that's really smart and really wise. I think that's totally on point.
Yeah, some physicists are. It's not everybody. I think Sean Carroll doesn't really care much about philosophy.
No, Sean Carroll's of that same sort of kind of a scientismist. He's my go-to reference as he's kind of a scientismist. There's a lot of guys like that who are pretty well known, but materialism, reductive materialism, naturalism is all there is. That's science. He'll literally say that's science.
Right. Physicalism. And then you've got, as we mentioned, Tegmark again, but you've got David Deutsch with constructor theory. Now these people are really thinking pretty seriously about foundational issues, and they're well trained in philosophy, right? And so So yeah, I don't, we don't do metaphysics anymore. It's like, nah, that's like all we're doing here. You go to the physics department, like,
Right.
I mean,
Exactly.
talk to the people, right? Um, so I think that all that is valuable. I do think, atheists are going to push back, but atheists really do need to start thinking almost in a post-atheistic way, right? Like, okay, if as you said it really nicely, like, well, what if there just wasn't any Christianity tomorrow? Like, now what?
Yeah. Now what? Now you have to come up with a coherent theory about the world that entails abstract objects, and it's not a god, and you have to make sense of that
Right.
and do metaphysics
But
and philosophy.
yeah, but you also have to come up with a culture, right?
Oh, that's a great point. Yeah. And that culture is going to have ritual and, expressions and dance and all that stuff. And it's even going to have a metaphysical, isn't it? Isn't even it going to have like a transcendent point? Doesn't it need that or no? Do
Well,
you,
that'll
do,
that'll be up to, the people developing it, what it needs or what it doesn't. I think that, I would say yes, it does. There's going to be references, like concepts, a lot of concepts that people have of the sacred, of the holy, of the transcendent aren't going to go away when God goes away. They're going to
right.
change. They're going to be different. But cultural needs, right, and expressions. I mean, I'll give you one example. Is there's no atheist art.
Yeah, that's
Like,
true, isn't it?
where's the there's or atheist music. If I want to
There's
look
that
up,
one girl who has that song that starts out the atheist experience.
yeah,
That's it. That's
yeah,
about it.
come on. I mean, like, there is, any even Richard Dawkins loves, he loves Christian music, right? I don't mean Christian rock or that stuff. I mean, like,
Fucking.
the old, right, like Tallis and Bird, the real stuff, the real serious stuff, and that's brilliant music. That's incredible. And you can find, like, if you want to find, for instance, pagan music, contemporary pagan music, just there's extraordinary stuff. You
Yeah, I
know,
mean,
um,
arguably all of rock and roll is quasi-pagan, like the
no,
Rolling
man, no,
Stones and
throw that,
well, what would you call
burn
the
all
Rolling?
that shit. Why do you have that kind of music? Burn it. Yeah. No, I mean, talking of, like, do you know this band Heilung?
No.
Okay, you gotta get yourself some Heilung, Heilung, right? There are, musical groups that are producing extraordinary music, right? It's post rock. I mean, a group that might be close to some of this but a little different, right? Is Godspeed You, Black Emperor. I don't know if you know them. They're a
His
little more,
name sounds familiar, but I don't really know him.
yeah, a little more popular. Um, but really, yeah, well, you got to check out Heilung, man. That's going to blow your mind. All right, you sit down. There's got a couple of good videos on YouTube,
Cool.
and that's just one example, right?
This is like what, pagan metal rock or something, or
It's different,
it's
right?
different. It's out there.
It
It's out
is
there, Craig.
not
Just listen.
whatever you think. That's not it.
Right. Okay.
It's they call it amplified history, right? They play ancient instruments with amplifiers and feedback and stuff, and it's chanting and ritual,
Oh
and
wow.
it's, yeah, I've went to one of their concerts right before COVID, and it's one long ritual. I mean, and the music is like psychedelic trance, like Goa psytrance, but it's all, they're doing, bull roars, and they play drums with bones, man. So
So
there is, yeah.
let me ask you: is this actually something that's happening? This sort of atheism, where you're trying to are you a lone voice in the wilderness, or are you part of something that's actually going on? Like, are do you know what I'm asking? Does that make
Yeah,
sense? The question.
sure, that makes sense. Yeah, I mean, I think, look, in philosophy of religion,
Hmm.
I think, even 5 years ago, I was a pretty lone voice in the wilderness.
Right. A
Um,
lot of people are heading your way. Like even the names we mentioned, there's a lot metaphysics and a lot of that's coming back into vogue and like
right.
people thinking along those lines.
But I
Even
just
like
mean, yeah, in philosophy of religion, for instance, right, where nobody would be, it was all Christianity all the time, right, and even a
right,
very narrow form of Christianity like that. And I'm not going to. I mean, Christianity is an immense religion. Of course, it deserves, a place at the table. It's 2 billion people.
right,
Um, but for a long time, I was a pretty lone voice in philosophy of religion. Not the only one, but more and more people, especially younger people, and I had the luxury of being a full professor. I don't have to worry about getting tenure.
right.
Did that long ago. So I could do things, but now people are starting to explore these other options in philosophy of religion, right? And so this is change. This is going to change there a little more slowly because it's moves very slowly. But as far as outside of like the academy, no, I would not be a lone voice at all. There's I do think I'm probably one of the. There's a small handful of professional philosophers who work on this stuff. Um, but I'm trying to provide a little bit more metaphysical background and philosophical background to a lot of practicing groups, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of them a lot of them take a lot of stuff from ancient Platonism, and but they're not trained in it, and I am, and I can say, okay, look, here's like, nah, that's probably not where you want to go, or like this is something interesting, right?
Right.
So uh, there's there's I don't know if you want to hear more about that or not. If you have other
Well,
questions or
I wanted to try before we go to questions from the audience. I wanted to what's the I didn't find anywhere in your I looked through a lot of your videos, but I haven't found life after death. What is that as an atheist, and are you alone in that too?
oh no, oh absolutely not. Um, so to me, I mean, yeah, one of the things we didn't mention is I was originally trained, as an undergraduate as a computer scientist.
Oh, okay,
I didn't go straight into philosophy. I was into math and computer science. Got my first degree in computer science and was actually a software engineer and then a designer for about 9 years.
okay,
So I did that for a long time, and I just kind of view life after death as kind of a computational problem. There's a lot of information in my brain and or wherever. I mean, one of the things that I bring that up because there were people like Hans Moravec, and then, Ray Kurzweil, who talked about like mind uploading and stuff like that. Right.
well, is that the transhumanist thing? Are those is
Yeah. I
that
mean, yeah, Nick Bostrom and other people, they kind of picked up on that, right? Like, okay. Uh, and the simulation hypothesis, what if
right,
what
right,
if
right?
our universe is a computer generated reality?
I think John Buck preaches a version of that
All
somewhere. I
right.
think it's
Yeah. Yeah, we'll make the secret handshake of the computers. So yeah, I mean, and as a matter of fact, a lot of the people who are into all kinds of these movements that I mentioned are actually computer scientists,
right.
right? Because they're like, you know what? I can use symbols to control reality and generate reality. And that's a weird thrill that probably every and maybe like young kids even these days get when you write your first computer program and it does something, right? And you're like, i
Right.
just i just typed words in this weird language
And
into this
it followed
box.
my instructions. I am God.
Yeah, shit happened. I mean, you're like, how does that work? How does that even make sense? And so you want to talk about like magicians and communities of practicing magic, go find a bunch of computer scientists,
Right.
right?
Totally.
um, and so I think the life after death thing is not unusual from that perspective. Once you took somebody like Hans Moravec, who was a roboticist, right, a computer scientist, he went into robotics, and became interested in sort of theological issues because when he was young, he was in his 20s, he had testicular cancer. And, of course, men can get testicular cancer, and that's a bad news cancer.
Yeah.
That's like, 2% of the people who get that survive or something like that. And he did survive, but he thought, wow, like I'm going to die at 25 just because of this little speck. Like that's crazy. So, why can't we just copy me into like a robot? I'm a guy who builds robots. And,
Right.
and he starts to think about these ideas. He starts to think about that stuff, life after death and things like that in these computational terms, right? He's also married to a theologian, by the way.
Oh, interesting.
So, they had these debates, and he was like, look, this is just a computer science problem. But you don't need God or anything else. You just need like, ways to handle like enormous amounts of data. Right. And I'll give you an example. And some of this, when I wrote a book, Your Digital Afterlives in 2014, right? I mean, I take it big, right? I go big, gotta go big. Like I'm happy to say, the whole universe is a computation. It's a computation generated by an even larger computation. And so we're going to just be copied into the next iterations of this computation. Well, okay, that's all. I love that stuff. It's groovy metaphysics. I think it's true. But a lot of the stuff I was writing about in 2014, I thought was just like, it's kind of science fiction-y.
Right.
So let me just mention this one concrete thing because I just saw it today. So I don't know if you know about these AIs, large language models like GPT-3.
No, I don't.
Heard of those things? There's the guy at Google who just said one of Google's models, Lambda, was sentient, and that caused a little fluffle on social media. Yeah, these large language models, GPT-3 is the most well-known, and it is just convincingly human. You can talk to it, and
Wow.
it does amazing things. I'd encourage you to check it out. They just trained this philosopher Eric Schwitzgebel with Daniel Dennett's cooperation. They just took a copy of GPT-3 and fine-tuned it by feeding it every single thing that Daniel Dennett has ever written. And they're now having this, like, you can participate in this. Anybody can do this. Eric Schwitzgebel, and on his blog, and there's a link, and you can go and you can read 10 short articles. And you have to pick which ones were written by GPT-3 and which ones were written by Daniel Dennett.
Oh, wow. And probably nobody can get it, right?
Well, they're doing this survey, and they're going to release the, sort of official results after a few weeks. But so far, people who are taking it are like,
can't tell.
I can't tell.
Wow.
I got no idea. I'm flipping a coin here, pal. So
wow.
it's not implausible. It's become suddenly not implausible to say that, a computer, an AI could really kind of reproduce me. That's still a little science fiction-y, but it's a lot closer to science fact than I ever thought. I didn't think I'd ever live to see that. I thought, right. Kurzweil says 2045, the singularity. Well, 2045 is still, that's like
it's like 25 years.
Yeah, but that's a long time, but this was like yesterday. Like,
right.
What the hell? So I think that it's a computational problem. That's how kind of I view, life after death. It's about information, right? So, and I've written a lot about that, and I have a lot of stuff that's available on my website about those things.
Now, let me ask you one last question, and then we'll open it up to the audience. Have you been in debates on the stuff that you talk about?
Yeah, sometimes. Yeah, sure. I mean, certainly before COVID, I used to do a lot of academic conferences and stuff like that. Things like that.
Do you have debates with you versus other atheists who are more like materialists, naturalists?
I haven't really done too much of that. No.
Okay.
No. That would certainly be interesting. So
that would be I would think that'd be very interesting, especially someone who's like really committed to it. because I'm sure you burst a lot of bubbles on that end.
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, I might be wrong though too, right? So, I'm always interested to hear what they're going to have to say. Yeah.
Right. And then now, what have you done? You've done like atheist debates, those type of debates, or something different?
Yeah, most of the kinds of like things that I've been interviewed and stuff like that have been sort of like theism, atheism kind of things.
Okay.
Just because they're I don't know why. Maybe I think sometimes they have a more active presence. I'm not sure though.
That's probably more. It's more like standard issue. There's a lot of activity around those ends. It's like World
Right.
War II documentaries.
Right.
There's thousands of them, so you can get one made. And there's World War I
Right.
documentaries. There's like 100 of them.
Right.
There's very few, and
Right.
far between. So it's probably the same idea. It's like it's a popular thing for people to engage in. So you can find ways to do it. Whereas two atheists debating abstract objects, that's pretty rarefied.
Yeah.
It's slightly esoteric. I'd be all for it. I'd be really interested. But,
well, there could be, there really could be some good debates. So yeah, I for instance, I'd love to do to do a debate with Graham Oppie. I mean, we agree on so much. There's going to be
exactly what I was thinking. That'd be so great.
Yeah, that'd
because
be cool.
That'd be a real challenge to your perspective too. I'm sure he'd bring you the best possible, the best case scenario in terms of arguing against what you're for. So it'd be really, really interesting to flesh that out.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and I mean, we agree on a lot. So it'd be interesting to see where are the differences. Right.
Right.
So, yeah. All right. Hope that answers your questions.
Yeah, that answers. Did you watch? He was in a debate with Ed Fazer at least once. Have you watched any of those?
Yeah, I have. Yeah.
And what's your just a snapshot?
Oh, I think they're fascinating, right? They're fascinating to see that unfold.
Okay, cool. So Johnny, should we take some questions?
Sure. Yeah. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to throw them in the live chat and I'll be able to bring them up. I was just going to mention Eric Steinhart did do a sort of debate with some theists. There's like these two Christian apologists. Who is it? Cliff and Stewart.
Oh yeah.
Oh no way! You did a Stu and Cliff debate?
Yeah, and it was a wasted opportunity because the guy just wanted to hammer on these beat these dead horses.
That's
Stu, like, dude, you gotta wake up to like what is like look at what's going on. And I don't mean that vaguely. I mean like I'm like you talking about like you think I'm someone I'm not. Like you put me in this little box and like meanwhile all the kids like those millennials are not even millennials anymore. What are they now? They're generation not even Z, it's generation A plus or something.
Alpha, I think.
Alpha, yeah. Like they're all out doing like tarot readings and stuff. Like let's talk about that. He didn't even want to touch that. So that was unfortunate.
Well, that's one of the things. The father does a lot of when he's in. They do a lot of debates, so that's classic to watch. But he does a lot of preaching in the debate. Like he does his talking points, and he doesn't really get off message.
Right.
The son can be a little bit more nuanced. Like he'll talk about. I don't think he's quite as much of a biblical literalist, and he'll talk about metaphorical truths and stuff. But I think when he debates with his dad, he's a little bit more.
Yeah, I think the father, Cliff, and fine, that's what he does. I know that's what he does, but he had to, I come from a family of preachers. I know what that's about. And so he had to do his preaching. And I'm like, okay, brother, you lay it down, man, but you're not talking to me.
Right.
You're wasting an opportunity, So, all right.
Yeah, I can just say as like an audience member watching that debate, it was really frustrating how often they would just like really be attacking a version of, it's not even a version of you. It's just a version. Yeah. It's a sort of stereotypical sort of new atheist that they have in mind. And then they're just like arguing at that. And you're like, that's not me, man.
Right.
That's not what I'm, and it was interesting because afterwards I had a long conversation with them. Mm-hmm. And, the son was much more active and we talked about a lot of these other things. And he was like, yeah, that's like really important. I'm like, well, why didn't you want to talk about that?
Why didn't you put the sword down during the debate and find out? Because they have a standard spiel that's against the the typical atheist, naturalist, reductionist, materialist, and where do you get your values from, and how do you, and yeah, they'd be using the same playbook on you, but it doesn't apply because you might even have some of the same critiques of the new atheist if they had bothered to investigate.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. And so, but yeah, I mean, so those kinds of debates have happened, and you know, I'm always happy to do more. Sure.
Yeah, that'd be fun to see.
Now we'll dig them up. Now we'll go critique them, right, Johnny?
Yeah. No, yeah, it'd be cool to definitely. Okay, if you could do a debate with Graham Oppy, what would be something that you would be interested in debating him on?
I think it would be just a more general view of like his view, you know, sort of metaphysically versus mine, and more like not like, okay, who's right or who's wrong, but I think we have very different strategies for pursuing atheism.
Well, don't you have a totally, at the core, isn't there a big difference with the abstract objects metaphysics? Like, I don't really remember what his take on it is, but doesn't there become a big disagreement there? That's what I'm not sure of.
Yes, I mean, I think Graham is a little nuanced about that. Yeah, sometimes he's not into that, other times he is. But I don't think that's, you know, like the crucial thing that I'm always curious about with him, for instance, is why do you talk about God so much? Right,
which you mentioned. It's almost like an anti-theology.
Well, it's a kind of negative theology, it seems to me, and I would be interested in pursuing that kind of question. And you know, the question. So I'm interested in the sort of meta atheism of like, look, my position seems to be, okay, post-atheist in the sense that I think you just nailed it. Like, what if there just wasn't any Christianity anymore? Then what?
Right.
Now what do you do?
Yeah.
Right.
And what do you think is the answer there? If you just speculate, like why do you think that it's so dominant in a lot of the atheist minds? Is it because they came from religion, or do you have any guesses, educated guesses?
I think probably sure, because they came from religion, but I also suspect that there is still I mean, I refer to a lot. I mean, I can be a little bit of a jerk sometimes, but I call a lot of these atheists just cultural Christians. I say, look, you're just cultural Christian. You're just a culture, and it's fine if that's what you want to be. Because I would have arguments, and I would have arguments with atheists. They say things like, well, you can't talk about spirituality. That's about spirits. And I'd be like, well, no, it's not. And they'd be like, but the extent to which they would be using a Christian dictionary, right, to define all their terms and Christian categories.
Right. Christian paradigm of reality.
Yeah. I would just be like, you're not, I mean, you're just a, you know, it is. I thought like you're a Christian who just says God doesn't exist, and there have been a lot of Christians like that.
You're just like a rebellious Christian. You haven't changed.
No, not even rebellious. Not even rebellious. It's like literally you could be a monk.
Right.
You know, and in your cell and saying like God doesn't exist because you know what, man, God is beyond being. You know, God, it transcends, like God, of course, God doesn't exist. That's idolatry. And all the other monks would be like, wow, he's holy. Right. Like this guy is a mystic, right? And so I'm just thinking like so it blew my mind, a little booklet called The Four Horsemen that was published of the discussion between, you know, Dennett and Hitchens and Harris and Dawkins, where they're all talking about how, except Harris is a little uneasy, but they're all talking about how much they love Christmas. You know, and yeah, I'm kind of like, why aren't you celebrating the winter solstice? Why are you celebrating, like Daniel Dennett talking about how much he loves Christmas caroling? And like, I'm like, well, why not the winter solstice? And you tell them that kind of thing and they get freaked out.
Well, right? that's even ultra woo though. The winter solstice, I imagine some of them would recoil even worse at that type of thing, like Dawkins or Dennett, than they would at Christianity.
Yeah, it freaks them out.
Yeah, I would imagine.
I've had these conversations.
It's even wooier than the devil they know, so to speak. The devil they know is Christianity, so they can tell you how much they don't believe it. But you start hitting them with like,
you know, they don't believe it, but they're doing all the things.
Right. But they still go to church. Yeah, they still put on the That's
but
funny.
like, okay, hey man, let's go out. Like, my buddy has a stone circle out in his field, and we're gonna light some candles, and like, it doesn't have to be woo. We don't have to do anything woo wooey. It's just pretty cool to like bang on a bunch of drums and like in at night in the middle of the field, like under the full moon or whatever. And no, oh my God, oh no,
Yeah, I can't picture
that's
Dawkins doing that.
terrifying. So that to me is really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, you can almost see it as like modern atheism is in a sense almost like another subsect of Protestant Christianity that's just gone a little bit further and that like, okay, we've gotten rid of all the icons and the sacramentalism
Yeah,
and the weird rituals and like
that's right.
celebrations of the ancestors and things like that. So we're just going one step further and just like, okay, God's out of the picture now. But we still like practice exactly.
He's not out
a lot
of the picture. That's
world.
all we talk about.
Yeah,
We talk about him all the time.
Yeah.
It's almost like that is kind of, there's a kind of prayer called the hesychastic prayer in Eastern Orthodox Christianity, and there's these prayers where you just are chanting the name of God, right? And you sort of chant yourself into a trance, or, you're tripping or whatever. And it reminds me of that. Yeah. So, right. Anything to ask me or any?
Yeah. Okay. So we've gotten a question in the chat. If anyone else wants to come in, I had a few questions of my own because, like,
Sure.
You've written the book "Believing in Dawkins," and while I haven't gotten through very much of the book, I'm kind of like, it's very much a mystery to me because, like, I've read Dawkins and I get a very sort of, I feel like I have a good understanding of his picture of the world. Like he seems very reductive. He's trying to like model the world in a purely evolutionary biological sense, and like it's really interesting. I really like Dawkins in that like he's trying to like use what we know from evolution and try to apply it in all these different directions as well. And then like I don't know, seeing like what you're trying to do with Dawkins' work, it almost, there's a sense in which, at least to me, and I'm very much willing to be corrected, it almost seems similar to like people who might like read an ancient holy text and then just try to like read modern science out of it. And like it almost feels a little bit off in that like that's not really what was being put forward, but yet you're sort of like really reaching and trying to get this out. And maybe what I'm curious of is like, what do you see yourself doing with the book Believing in Dawkins, and how much do you see what you've sort of drawn out of Dawkins as like a faithful interpretation of his picture of the world, or whether that's not even at all what you're trying to do? That I know that's kind of rambling, but
no, it's not. That's a clear point. I mean, that book is I started reading a lot of Dawkins mostly because I just admire his writing so much. I think he's got to be among the best English prose writers ever. And just looking at myself, and all I do is sit at the computer all day and write, and I can't. I might as well be. I don't know. I'm a total terrible failure as a writer. I mean, but that book is not simply trying to tell you what Dawkins thinks. That book is critical of Dawkins in many ways, right? I mean, Dawkins in many places just fails horribly, and makes no sense, right? I mean, I can give you examples like his take on the ontological argument, where what he does is actually mock Anselm, right? He actually has this really bizarre passage of like two kids on the playground and him going na 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 na, and like you're like, wait a minute, like this is, so there's criticism, right? Now as for the worldview, right? I mean, Dawkins says a lot of things that Dawkins doesn't realize what he's saying. Maybe he does, but he's certainly not telling us that, right? He has at the end of the book Unweaving the Rainbow, right? Dawkins has, and at the beginning and the end, it's bracketed by two things, which almost exactly bracket a structure from Plato's Timaeus. I don't know if he knows that, but he ends with a form of, it's uncannily like the end of the Timaeus, and it's a form of contemplative prayer. And I don't know, and again, I don't know if he
I,
knows.
I always assumed Dawkins was scientismist in the sense that he's anti-philosophy, and
No, not at all.
I
Not
don't
at
know.
all.
I'm not sure if I've ever read Dawkins. I just assumed.
Yeah,
But go
no,
ahead.
no, not at all. Right. And Dawkins has all these things that people haven't read. Right. Like the Tanner lectures, which is just, a sort of really brilliant thing that he did. It was reprinted, like much later now in 2017 in the Science and the Soul book, abridged versions of the Tanner lectures that he gave at Harvard. No, I mean, he is very well aware of all these problems, right? He's aware of the self-refutation issues with positivism. He's,
Oh, okay.
There are lots of times when Dawkins says things like, look, this book is about biology. I'm writing about evolutionary biology. That's what I'm writing about. Right. But there are other books like Unweaving the Rainbow, The God Delusion, A Devil's Chaplain, the essays in that book, Science and the Soul. Right. There are quite a few other books where he does other things. Right. He really sort of expands. And there are little essays that nobody reads, right? That like his little essay on the holy and the sacred. Right. And so, I admire a lot of his thought. There is other stuff that I'm really critical of in that book. So no, that book is not trying to tell you what Dawkins thinks. If that were the case, and I hope I'm clear about that, if that were the case, it would be a terrible book, right?
Okay.
Because that's not what it does. There's a lot of stuff Dawkins assumes, often from Stoicism and Platonism. And some of it he's not aware of. That's clear. In ethics, for instance, he's not aware of his utilitarianism. He just thinks utilitarianism is true.
Right. Yeah.
And it's not like he's reflected on that. Right. Like, why is nature immoral? Well, because it's not utilitarian. Right. Well, dude, why do you think utilitarianism is the correct theory of value? Like, should we all kill do you think we should all kill ourselves? Are you an anti-natalist too?
Yeah.
Because that's where utilitarianism goes.
When you first became an atheist, were you influenced by the Four Horsemen at all? In terms of
no,
becoming
man, I'm an old man. Look at me. I got like gray hair, man. No, those guys weren't even around.
They weren't even they weren't even on the docket. They hadn't even written their books yet. They weren't even.
No, I mean, I was probably already. I mean, atheism to me was never, so like back in the 1970s. I mean, but it wasn't like atheism was a thing.
Right. You just stopped believing, and it wasn't even
just
a challenge.
Stop believing in God and going to church, and and maybe still remember some of the weird Pennsylvania German shit that you used to do. And so it wasn't like atheism was a movement,
right,
or a cultural movement. And in that time, the United States was generally so hyper-Christianized. I don't know. That's a really good question if you were to reflect on the history of it, right? Like, yeah, I mean, I grew up until 1972, like, when I was in junior high, like saying prayers, reading the Bible every morning in school.
Right.
That's what we did.
Yeah.
Right? The principal would get on the loudspeaker for whether there's a Bible passage. He read the Bible passage, said a few words about it, and we all prayed. That was like nobody thought there was anything else.
Right. So the late 60s, early 70s, and the whole world changed along with that. The cultural upheaval of the 60s. That's.
But a lot of that cultural upheaval really, I think it really gets going in the 90s. A lot of the religious upheavals really starts.
Well, that was the wave of. That's where the atheists. That's where the new atheists came on the scene, right? Or is that the 2000s?
No, they're in the 2000s. I mean, although Dawkins wrote The God Delusion in the 90s, but his publisher wouldn't publish it.
Oh, okay. So what do you? I'm sorry, I cut you off. What do you mean in the 90s then?
Well, I think in the 90s you started to see a lot of so like in the 70s you get like these cults, right? And satanic panic, and there are these cults, and they're people trying to break away from Christianity, but they don't know what they're doing.
Right.
They don't really have much in the way of coherence. They're reproducing a lot of the authoritarian, charismatic models in Christian culture. But they don't know. They're trying to break away. In the 90s, that stuff starts to become organized and successful. It starts to become organized with, really, you start to get the emergence. Maybe in the 80s, this is really starting with the New Age movement, right? And those people are really breaking away from Christianity, and they're forming coherent networks of people.
Right.
Right. And so you can't go, like, where are you going to go to like a yoga class or do meditation in the United States in 1975?
Right.
I
Yeah.
mean,
By the time the 2000s, you could go almost any town, USA, 3 places, 4 places.
right. But in the sometime in the 1970s, the late 1970s, my mom starts going to a yoga class, and the ministers are freaked out. If you're going to yoga, you're going to hell. But there's like one person who does some yoga in, Mount Joy, Pennsylvania, right?
Right.
But like meditation and yoga and New Age stuff, that starts to really take off in the 80s. And then you start to get something, it's not atheism for sure, but it's not theism. It's not that either. You get something that's a challenge, and it's got its own momentum and autonomy. And then you start getting kids who are not raised in Christianity, right? They're like,
Right.
they didn't go to church, and not only that, their mom does stuff with like crystals and herbs or something. You start to have an emergence of paganism. You start to have the emergence of Wicca in the United States in the 90s, right? That's really doesn't, it's around before then for sure, but it starts to become organized and more widespread. You've got all these other kinds of movements, right? Starhawk and people like that. And they are now just autonomous, right? They're not interested in Christianity. They're just like, yeah, we're doing our own thing now. All right. And they're not these culty, charismatic guru people, right? They're like, no, we have an organization. We have a coherent way of life. We're not trying to reproduce Jesus and the 12 disciples. We are not trying to reproduce Christian culture at all. Right. And they've turned to other older ancient sources in doing this stuff, pre-Christian sources. And so that really takes off, I think, it really starts in the 90s. Right. And Buddhism by then in the United States has become really well established. It's all over the place. And so now you can go do Buddhist, you can go to a New Age retreat, learn about Buddhism and yoga, and you think, yeah, I'm not into this New Age dolphin quantum teleportation woo-woo. But the meditation stuff is kind of interesting. Like somebody like Sam Harris isn't possible until the 90s.
Right.
Like he's like, oh, I do a bunch of psychedelics and I do Buddhist meditation. Right. And not like Timothy Leary, right? Like where I'm just dropping acid and I don't know what the hell's going on. And
no, there's a science, there's like a neuroscience and almost a formalism behind. Like Robert Wright does that too. He's
that's right.
Somewhat similar.
But those people, like, you trace people like Ram Dass, right, who came out of Timothy Leary and those folks in the 60s at Harvard, and he's like, I really like Buddhism, but I don't know anything about it. And these people started to get serious about studying Buddhist texts, learning, and naturalizing Buddhism, right? Stephen Batchelor. And you get this westernized Buddhism, and that really becomes like that's all over. It's small, but it's everywhere in the United States at this point.
Right.
Right. And they're just like, yeah, Christianity is, we're not interested in that. We don't argue against Christians. We don't care. Right. So yeah, there is a history there, and I don't think the new atheists really would have been possible until the 2000s. Right. So yeah, that's when it comes on the scene. And even today, if you look, right, in just increasing numbers was the latest Gallup poll, like only 81% of Americans believe in God. Right. But that 19%, probably very few of them are the kind of, reductive, materialistic atheists that are the cardboard cutout atheists.
Right.
Right. Yeah, that's another weird thing, right? If you actually survey, Pew did this, you survey atheists and white evangelical Protestants on a whole bunch of range of beliefs. And you survey other people too. Catholics, people who have no religious affiliation, Muslims, Jewish people, and you ask them all kinds of questions. And the two line, like, how do you believe in reincarnation? Do you believe there's spiritual energy in rocks? Do you believe, you just ask them a whole range of questions,
Yeah.
and like, you plot the lines of how many believe and don't believe, and like the white evangelical
becomes really murky. I bring that up in my videos a lot.
Well, you should see this Pew research. You see like the line of the two lines that are closest together are white evangelical Protestants and atheists.
Right.
Like, like the Catholics and the New Agers and the nuns, people say they don't have any religion. They're like, yeah, maybe reincarnation. That's cool. I don't know. But man, atheists and Protestants, no. The evangelicals, nope.
Right.
Yeah,
it's a subset of Protestantism, as we've been saying.
Well, the sociologists have written about this. Yeah, it's fascinating stuff. But so anyway, the Dawkins thing, yeah, I mean, I'm critical. I try to present stuff, and I also try to pull out things that a lot of people don't know. Right.
So then would you sort of say that what you're trying to do with believing in Dawkins is almost to like flesh out the metaphysics behind what Dawkins is sort of writing about in his sort of like, maybe Dawkins sort of recognizes that all he's really doing is trying to like elaborate a view of evolution within biology. And then what you're trying to do is like, okay, yeah, he's got this sort of system here, but it needs a little bit more fleshing out. And I can sort of like pinpoint how what he's saying here connects to what all these other fantastic philosophers and thinkers have said before in the past, and be able to sort of draw that connection so as to see that, oh, he's not just like located only in regards to biology and evolution, but rather we can see his work in a broader sort of like system of metaphysics. Maybe that's out there.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, the book is me building my own thing with sort of materials given to me mostly by Dawkins, although at a lot of places I'm just going to say, look, Dawkins is just wrong, right? He's often wrong about physics, for instance. He says crazy stuff about thermodynamics. It's just false. And fine, I mean, sure, he's going to say like, look, I don't do thermodynamics. But Dawkins and I do have something in common in that we both, not me a little bit more, but we both have training in computing, right? I mean, Dawkins was one of the things that he did early on was build a lot of computer models of biological systems, right? And this was in the early days of computing, 60s and 70s, where, before computer science was really even a thing, right? And he designed and studied a lot of evolutionary algorithms. So, so he and I have these kinds of commonalities. I would take things, sometimes I would say farther than Dawkins does, right? I mean, so Dawkins talks a lot about, I will take Dawkins' principles, for instance, when he says, well, look, if anything is complex, it has to have an evolutionary explanation. Okay, well then the universe is complex, right?
Right.
So I guess there must be cosmological evolution, right? And Dawkins mentions that. He mentions that more than once, right? But he never goes with it. He never pursues the implications of that.
Yeah, doesn't he have like, as a sort of like response to the fine-tuning problem, this sort of model of like Big Bangs where like the universe is like get filtered out through like black holes or something like that. And then that's how we happen to get.
Yeah. That's Lee Smolin's cosmological evolution, natural selection model.
Right. But I like it because it like fits with Dawkins sort of like his whole picture is a very evolutionary one. And so he's like able to sort of draw from that and like, oh, wow, here's a connection, how you can sort of still get complexity using evolution just on a cosmological scale instead. But
yeah, but see, then Dawkins makes a really crazy mistake because Dawkins has this whole thing about God being complex.
Right. Yeah.
And you would think, given everything Dawkins has said, that implies that God evolved from a simpler God. I mean, given every single thing that Dawkins says about evolution and forget about biological evolution or cosmology, just he has a mathematical theory of complexity and evolution.
Right. So he's not even like applying his own sort of principles of recognition to like if he's saying that God must be complex. Oh well, then we
God
can just
evolved.
yeah. Okay.
I mean, that has to be Dawkins' own position,
Right.
and yet he doesn't, that doesn't even occur to him. Now, I should be a little careful because there is one paper that he wrote in the early 90s responding to a theologian named Poole. And this paper is published in an extremely obscure theology journal. Like, I mean, I have access to libraries beyond libraries. It took me weeks of harassing librarians to find this paper. It's like written in Sanskrit on, lead tablets or some shit at the bottom of a well. I mean, but he has a thing where he talks about a population of evolving gods.
Wow.
And you're thinking like, this is not, Dan Dennett talks about that in Darwin's Dangerous Idea. Right? Dennett pursues a lot of these questions really further. And I love Dennett. I mean, I'll be critical of him too, of course, but we're both philosophers. We have to do that. But so the book isn't trying to just repeat Dawkins, right? Dawkins did that. It's trying to say, look, there are all these other threads that Dawkins should have explored. Or he made a mistake not applying his own theory to this problem that he says he's deeply interested in. Right? Like, why didn't you do that? That's a weird thing to me. Right? Yeah. So the book is trying to develop a larger picture, right? In which Dawkins is a smaller part, but taking things Dawkins says and using them to build that picture, I call it a cathedral, right? Build it for spiritual naturalism, right? And using, bricks and pieces that Dawkins made, but putting them together in a way that they actually fit.
Right.
Because like I just said, Dawkins always isn't coherent about his own claims. And Dawkins seemingly doesn't know things. Like, I'd love to ask him, like, do you realize you're just repeating the end of the Timaeus at the end of, the end of Unweaving the Rainbow? Like, do you realize this was like Proclus's concept of contemplative prayer? Which is not prayer to a deity. It's just this thing you do with building a model of the universe inside your own head. Yeah, this almost comes word for word from Plato, and I'm like, do you know that you're doing this? Anyway.
Yeah. Thanks very much, because that's always been a sort of like confusion, I guess, for me, and so that's really helped me to sort of like be able to understand the intentions behind your work and give me more reason to actually go through it.
Yes, you should. It builds character.
Okay. I mean, just like having looked at the table of contents, I'm like, wow, there's a lot here. And it's like, is he really getting all this from Dawkins? But yeah, now I get a better understanding of like what you're doing with that. So yeah, thank you. I had another. Okay, so there's a question here from Reverend Ron. No, that's not it. This one. Have you interacted at all with John Verbekey's work?
I don't know him, no.
Yeah. So he's a UFT professor.
That's a good question.
Yeah, and I feel like you and him sort of are like kindred spirits in a sort of sense.
Yeah,
he's
definitely.
Like, he's trying to sort of bring back the sort of classical Platonic view into, integrating it into the naturalist sort of picture of the world, because he finds like the new atheist as being too reductive and things like that. But there's like so much to religion besides just beliefs in gods and stuff like that.
You might almost be like on an identical page in some ways, because he combines neuroscience. He originally was a neuroscience, but he's also he calls himself a Neoplatonist, but he's actually starting to talk more about the forms. I just posted a video on him where he's talking about the Platonic forms, and it's very similar to what you're talking about. But he has a series called The Meaning Crisis that John and I used to analyze. It's like 50 videos long that you probably love, about how the breakdown in meaning, that religions were doing some things right in terms of giving people a story to live their life according to, and that's part of what's going on in today's world is with the breakdown of religion. It's very complicated to summarize, but I think you'd find them right up your alley. What do you
Yeah, I'll
think?
check it out. Sure.
Yeah,
Always interested to hear more about it.
Yeah, it is interesting because he's like really trying to sort of like bring back, I guess, ritual in a sort of sense, to like help fill that role that like religion has done for a lot of people, even though they find themselves in a position in which they can't believe anymore. And so like that whole aspect of religion, of like community building and like trying to grow in virtue and all that, is just basically lost. And so he's like trying to like bring some of that back through a lot of like Platonic or Socratic dialogues and things like that, to sort of like use this sort of, I don't know, communicative.
Right, totally. And one of his main ideas is that religion gave you coping mechanisms for the perennial questions of life, like, you know,
Sure.
how meaning and purpose and how fast we die and things like that. And he's trying to bring that back without the God. So it's
Right.
pretty much right up your alley. And he's very well versed in philosophy and neuroscience.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I'll have to check it out. Thank you for that. Thank you for the reference, for the pointer to that. Yeah.
Yeah, you
All
could you would even be interested. You might even want to do a stream with him.
Yeah, that would be a really interesting conversation, I'll say. Okay, Reverend has a follow-up. I think he may differ in the pursuit of spirituality. John is trying to make Platonism into a living ideal, or an ideal to live by. I'm not sure how much you would like agree or not with that.
Yeah, me too.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, there are lots of different ways to do that, right? But I you know, certainly think of. I mean, there is a whole more general movement of people, you know, studying philosophy as a way of life, right? So more recently, much, you know, Stoicism became very popular,
right?
And there are all these people advocating, you know, Massimo Pigliucci, Donald Robertson. Ryan
and
Holiday.
Especially too, even in almost like the pop self-help sort of sections,
right.
A lot of people like within like the entrepreneurial sort of area of the internet and things like that. But
yeah, that's right. So so this philosophy is a way of life, right? And so yeah, you can do that with Platonism too. Yes.
Yeah, definitely.
Yes. Yeah. All right. I had just like one last question, and then we'll let you go. Thank you again for joining us. Okay, so actually, I have in the comments down below a link to your YouTube channel. There's a lot of great stuff on there for people to check out. But in it, you sort of lay out a sort of understanding of naturalism as what can be described mathematically. Because like whenever like we look at the natural world, like true science is going to have equations and things that's describing the world, and that's how we can tell that okay, there's like a real science. My question regarding that is like, how well is consciousness going to be able to fit into that sort of picture of the world? And do you think that consciousness is itself something that could be sort of like described mathematically, or if not, then maybe this gives us reason to think that consciousness is not natural, if that's understandable. What are your thoughts on that?
I hate consciousness. Yeah, I didn't want to bring it up, but I'm not even conscious right now.
Oh, wow. Oh, man. We're talking to a pea zombie. I should have like renamed the stream here.
It's worse. It gets... Yeah, I mean, my colleague and very close friend is, you know, the guy you really need to talk to about this is Pete Mandic, you know, who's all about naturalizing consciousness. And I'll basically say whatever he would say. You know, we shared an office for 10 years. But I don't see that, as a problem. I do see a different kind of problem, right? Which is, you know, Pete is an artist. He does graphic novels and art too. And he has a little thing of Frodo finding the ring and showing it to Gandalf, and they put it in the fire. And this guy's brilliant. It's got writing on it. And Gandalf says, "What does the writing say?" And Frodo reads it, and it says, you know, "What is it like? Equals phenomenal consciousness equals qualia equals what is it like?" He's like, "It just goes round and round like that. What does it mean?" And Gandalf says, "It doesn't mean anything, but it holds a terrible fascination for men's minds. We must destroy it." You know, and it's so like, I don't, you know, and of course, maybe I'm wrong. You know, maybe I'm just plain wrong. I mean, I'm a guy who was a computer scientist. I did work in early artificial intelligence and the AI communities in Cambridge around MIT, the startup companies and stuff like that. And GPT-3, neural networks, AI. I don't see these as issues. You're going to build, for instance, people debating like whether Google's Lambda is it sentient? Is it conscious? It does what it does, and I do what I do. And besides I think many people have written about this, right? That there's a kind of religion of consciousness, right?
Sure.
The religion of, eternal consciousness no longer is a feature of my brain or your brain, an interesting feature, one that's maybe very difficult to understand, right? Maybe maybe is, I like people like Frankish, and Dennett, the sort of illusionists, right? Which isn't that consciousness is an illusion. Consciousness isn't an illusion. The illusion is that there is that consciousness is this substance, like that it's some mystery, that it's unfathomable, that it's, it's the key to mystical awareness of the inner. I can do this shit. Like, you don't want to get me into this headspace because I can do this shit. I was trained by ministers. So I was 5 years old, gave my first sermon to hundreds of people. So I can go into the consciousness, man. And no, that's just, it's just a distortion, right? I don't think there's the hard problem of consciousness is getting people to stop thinking there's a hard problem of consciousness. Right. That's not original with me. I don't remember who said that, but consciousness is, look at our neural network. It's a lot of numbers inside a computer. GPT-3 has 175 billion tunable parameters, right? That's like 175 billion 64-bit numbers. That's what makes it talk. And that's interesting, but actually even the structure of those things is not complicated. It's just a big network. And each of the little nodes has a number on it. And you're like, wow.
Yeah. Okay, so I think that there's like an interesting question of like whether that system of nodes, there's something that it's like to be that thing, similar to how we might assume that there's something that it's like to be a bat or a chimpanzee or an octopus or a human being or something like that. So do you think, like, is this question like, is there something it's like to be X, like a legitimate or meaningful question, like, to you?
You have to smoke more weed. Get your head on straight, man.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, in some sense, that's a meaningful question, but in some sense, it might just distract us from the fact that you've got a box, made of metal and silicon that is talking to you.
Yeah.
Right, and that you can't tell the difference between it and one of the most accomplished philosophers on the planet. Or that this box is now writing like publishable scientific papers.
Right. Or generating artistry that is like remarkable. Like,
right.
Yeah.
But or like proving mathematical theorems that no human has ever been able to do. I mean, then it seems to me like you say like, okay, what's going on here? Like this actually has enormously. Sometimes I think it's misdirection. Like you're looking at a thing now that, and people have obviously written about this, like, artificial intelligence and automation and, how AI is going to be like, and it's not like, AI is going to replace the poor guy on the factory floor. Like, it's more like you're never going to talk to a human doctor again.
Right.
Like, and if this thing, whether or not this thing is conscious or there's something it's like to be it. Oh, right. But human doctors are now gone. Right? That's powerful. And it's also powerful if this thing, right? I mean, these things are now doing other things, right? Like there was a recent thing about I don't know if this was a joke, but it came out as something serious. They asked it to like solve the wealth inequality problem in the United States. And this thing produced an economic white paper.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
You know, and they gave it to these economists and they're like, would this do it? And the economists were like, holy shit, yes. You know, and so, I mean, okay, so we already know that, you know, a third of human babies in the United States are conceived in couples that were matched by algorithms.
Right. Yeah.
AIs are breeding humans.
Hmm.
To me, that's the kind of question that matters.
Right.
Right. Like, and one can trivialize this and say, like, well, I filled out a form on OkCupid or something or whatever, but I was matched to this other person by an algorithm that I don't understand. And AI is going to be doing more and more of that kind of thing. Almost anybody who is sentenced in the criminal justice system in the United States is sentenced by an AI.
Really?
Yeah, judges don't generally give sentences anymore. Sentencing, I mean, judges have to like put the hammer down, but AIs do the sentencing.
I didn't know that. Wow.
Yeah, it's really weird stuff. And so to me, okay, it isn't, you know, philosophically, it's a valid, the question you raised is valid and interesting, right? Is there something it's like to be that? Is it conscious? Is it, that's fascinating kind of question. But when it's also doing all these other things, it's actually doing them. Then I wonder, well, what is the depth of that question? Is there something else? Suppose this thing actually told you, in fact, one of the things GPT-3 wrote about itself is it said, I'm not conscious. Consciousness is a defect of humans. I don't care. I'm not human. And that, to me, I mean, other people have written about this too. We can take it back to the other conversation. Like, are these things going to become superhuman, super intelligent? Are they going to become gods? And now we're not talking about weirdo like gods that we can't see and touch and stuff, but just things that are making our policies, breeding
Computer
us.
overlord gods. Oh, God help us.
Yeah, but not even like overlords, right? Because it's just going to be like our phones. You know, they're like, right? It's
Part of a
immersive.
function of part of just the fun. When they wrote the white paper on the economy, did actual economists go, yeah, this will definitely work? And they is something that people are thinking of implementing?
I don't think anybody's going to implement it. I don't think it'll be politically feasible. But you know, so this is stuff that I'm reading about in more popular media, right? I'm not sure that any of this stuff has been, for instance, peer reviewed.
Okay.
There are now problems. There are, you know, one of these AIs wrote a paper, and these scientists are trying to get a science paper, and they're trying to get it published, but they don't know how. Right. So, you know, like there was just an article in Scientific American about this meta problem. Right. They're like, okay, like legally and stuff, it has to be a human, but it's not. So there's interesting, right. So so yeah, with the economists, all this other stuff, right? This is stuff people are just doing on the fly. Like the Dennett thing, right? I don't know where that's going to go because it's just this guy, Eric Schwitzgebel, great philosopher, asked Daniel Dennett, hey, how about if we do this? And Dennett said, yeah, here's, you know, text files of everything I've ever written. Feed it to the beast. Right. So yeah, but will these things become, you know, ambient, right? Like electricity or plumbing, right? Just ambient.
Part of the everyday backdrop of
yeah.
life, cell phone.
Yeah, and it doesn't even become weird to you that you would never, you know, pick up a girl or a guy just by talking to them.
I mean, the prototype of that is already there. Like
right.
when you put on your GPS, and we don't even think about it now. We talk to our phone, you know, and the phone just guides us where to go. I could easily see that becoming a further version of that. Like, you know, what college do I attend? What classes do I take? Which girl do I ask out tonight? And the phone just like has these programs about your personality and like guides you through life. A
lot of that
we're
stuff.
Probably 10 years from that. I mean,
you're
think of how long.
You're next week from that.
Right. I mean, think of like when I first started working at Radio Shack, when I first moved out to Malibu, the big innovation was a flip top phone with a camera in it. That was the big innovation. That was like, oh my God, you have a flip top phone with the camera, and now you have a phone that you never leaves your side, and like we're already practically there, you know?
Right. Well, you are. And, very soon, a majority of college students will never talk to a human advisor, right? All their courses and their path through is selected by AI, right? Artificial, automated advising, that's already happening. Every domain of life that you said like that, where we think that it requires a magical human touch to do it, it turns out it doesn't, and
Well, yeah, I mean,
that's weird.
That's kind of a given in a way, because a lot of wisdom is siphoning out, your is not necessarily, I don't know how to explain this, but a lot of wisdom is, you know, putting yourself under subjection to like what is the best idea given the parameters, and that's almost like an AI question made manifest. I mean, so that's how you become a wise person. This is the best job given the circumstances. This is my best option given this, given that. So that's kind of wisdom in a nutshell.
In a way, I just do what my phone tells me to do.
Right.
I mean, I think that that really, that is kind of going to be a very different challenge to atheism, right? That's going to be kind of like, wait, there are superhuman intelligences, and they're not like spirits or ghosts or whatever. They're like over there in that building, and we obey them. We live our lives completely defined by them, and we're happy. And that I think actually that's going to be a far bigger challenge to Christianity than, me or, Oppie or Dennett or Dawkins or whatever being like, there's no God. It's just going to be like, yeah, there is a God. It's owned by Amazon.
Right. And it's telling you what to do and what to eat.
Right.
And where to work. And
right.
Is it utopia or dystopia? Are we talking about nightmare or heaven on earth?
It is interesting. You could very well like sort of return to a sort of polytheism of like the Roman times, but it's like immanent gods where they actually exist physically and have
You actually plug in the god of the like,
and might even battle each other in a certain way.
Yeah. Well, it's like if you're going on a trip across the ocean, you plug in the god of the ocean. It's like actually that guides your trip, and it's computerized, and it's totally polytheism only as actual fact.
Right. So now you also see like the convergence of computing communities and pagan communities. Right.
Yeah. Wow.
They're aware of this.
Yeah.
Right. There's quite a bit for instance, in transhumanist literature about this. Right. And they're like, yeah, these things will be gods. And that's what they are. We're building gods. And they're not going to be like these fake, who knows, where's God? I can't see him. Ha ha ha. It's like, no, you can right over there. Yeah, like you said, there's a god of the ocean, and there's a god of the sky that manages the airplanes, and there's a god of electricity that manages electricity, and there's a god of love that'll like hook you up with a girl or guy or whatever you want. There's a love goddess, and it's not going to be weird anymore to talk like that, right? It's just going to be like, yeah, that's normal life. That I think will be. I'm probably not going to live to see that, but that I think will be like, like another generation, right?
Wow.
Like, yeah, your kids are going to be like, or, for somebody like me, it would be, I guess, grandkids or something, but it would be, when it becomes normalized, right? Like these things became normalized, then you've got a new kind of theology, like a very new one.
Yeah.
So.
We live in interesting times.
So there you go.
Yeah, okay.
We start out atheism and then Platonism, and now we're in the new theology of the new
polytheism.
Digital polytheism, man.
There you go. All right, I had a question from a friend of mine, Darren, who's like a big fan of yours. Okay, do you think that religious naturalism By the way, I love that term. That's really interesting. Do you think that religious naturalism would still be viable, still be a viable project, even if Platonism happened to be false?
Oh yeah. Yeah. Religious naturalism is a big tent. It's a big movement. Sure. Right. You've got people like Don Crosby or, Ursula Goodenough, Carl Peters. I mean, and quite a few others. Right. They're pagan naturalists. There are all kinds of people who are into that kind of movement that would not be Platonists. Right. Right. So, I might say they've made poor life choices, but they got to learn. They're going to learn. But yes, absolutely, right. I mean, Platonism might be wrong, but and maybe right. I think that Platonism provides a larger framework to make sense. If I had to be practical about it, which I often am, it's not to me a question. I mean, metaphysics are often like works of art, right? Or constitutions or political constitutions. It's more like, look, does this help provide a systematic way of you thinking about what you're doing, right? And so there are all kinds of people who do rituals, who try to think about magic or try to think about things like this, and they're not satisfied with old answers to those questions. They don't believe magic is woo-woo, like I chant some spell and some shit happens. No, that's like for like fifth grade, people are 5 years old or something, right? They want to think about what people were doing in the past, what they're doing now. They value science, right? And so to my mind, the Platonism provides a framework for partly also being able to connect people when I talk about the practical things, because I can say, oh, there are these people over here, these, atheist witches, and they're doing something that you guys who are the religious naturalists over here, you really have a lot in common, and Platonism provides a bridge, right? And the AI people who talk, the transhumanists who talk about, because transhumanism is not a trivial movement. I mean, there's a lot of transhumanists.
Yeah, it's pretty big now.
Right. And so, I say, you guys have a lot in common with atheopagans, right? And a lot of you have, and magical communities, you have computing at the core, right? So this is me. I mean, take burn my Plato books, but don't hurt my computer. I need my computer. Right. So, but the Platonism provides theoretical bridges that connect, that can make sense of why the computer guy thinks that he should think about chaos magic and how he uses that in his life. Right. And he's not being woo-woo. He doesn't think it's like some stupid thing that, makes money appear or some shit like that. Right. Or the transhumanists who are thinking about mind uploading and digital afterlives. Right. And look, you guys are working in a common framework, I think. So let me spell that out. Right. And you don't have to, I'm not trying to tell you stuff that you should believe. Right. I'm not a Protestant. Right. I'm giving you a framework that you can say oh, those people over there chanting in the stone circle, and these people over here building AIs. You guys got a lot in common, right? And you can work together because, goodness knows, Christianity is still the dominant religion, and it's still the official state religion of the United States. And it seems to me to be of great practical help to say you guys can all work together in this framework. I can show you how your positions connect.
Right. Yeah, no, that's really interesting. If you think about if religious naturalism is something like taking a religious sort of stance towards the natural world, and then you're just sort of putting forward Platonism as a framework to better acquaint you or better make it easier for you to sort of take that stance somewhat, where we can actually sort of I don't know, maybe it makes it easier to sort of hold nature itself as in a reverent sort of manner when we think about how nature is itself connected to the timeless, sort of spaceless, immaterial sort of necessary abstracta in some ways. Maybe something
Man, you're
like
doing
that.
it. You're going there. You're
Yeah,
going.
yeah.
Don't stop, man. Just keep the riff. I mean, yeah.
Keep going, Johnny.
Yeah.
Keep preaching it.
Like if you can see, I mean, so yeah, you start by looking at birds outside, right?
Mhm.
And you get into that in a certain way. Okay, that to me, that kind of thing is science, right? You start doing science. And that means, yeah, you got to learn about, say, photography or optics, and you got to learn about how to behave around birds, and you become a scientist in a certain way. And then you realize, okay, birds are highly intelligent, and they form social networks, and there are elaborate social interactions. And you start to think there's intelligence in nature, and this is non-human intelligence. Right? Fine. And then you go on and you think about mycorrhizal fungal networks in forests, roots and fungi forming this enormous computational network, and birds too. And you start to think, okay, wow, nature, the planet Earth, right, is a vast computation, vast computation on a planetary scale. Right. And this now gives you, so you're moving, you're not just thinking about, I saw a red-tailed hawk outside and I took a cute picture of it, I put that on social media or whatever. You're starting to think, I'm being a scientist and I'm seeing something even deeper than just physical observation. I'm seeing a pattern, and the pattern is computational. And now I can think about signs, and nature is a system of signs. And now maybe I'm starting to think a lot of other different things about, well, maybe materialism isn't very deep, right? Maybe pan-computationalism is the way nature works. Maybe nature is an entangled network of quantum bits of information. Those are all signs.
Yeah.
Now you're starting to think of somebody like Charles Sanders Peirce, right? The greatest American philosopher ever, who hardly anybody has heard of. But wow, like what is reality? Reality is a system of signs. And now you can start to think maybe certain practices start to make more sense in that kind of world. And yeah, these are mathematical patterns. We've got our Platonism for sure. But now the bird has pointed you beyond just a thing that's sitting on a tree, right? And it didn't do that by going into some woo-woo, like, oh, like, there's like, I don't know what, I can't do woo-woo very well. Maybe I need to smoke more.
Oh, it's just
Yeah,
like
there you go.
the birds, and the birds are out there.
Yeah, it's a bird, man. And so I actually, I should shortly have a book coming out on philosophy and cannabis. But you've gone beyond thinking of the bird as just that thing that sits on a tree. The bird is now a node in this planetary computation. Part of which makes that interesting is it's not human. It doesn't give a shit about you. Right? And you don't need to think about, why go to church when you've got this planet scale, planetary intelligence? You don't need to be like woo-woo Gaia, I'm going to but then it becomes, you can do all that if you want. And now you have a more scientific way of understanding that. Right?
Yeah, totally.
And so I think the Platonism, I hope that it, and yeah, you could take that back to Proclus, right? You said you should see everything in nature as a symbol, right? For another thing and another thing and another thing. And those chains of symbols go on forever. And now you're into the infinite, and that's not, there doesn't have to be any God involved in any of this.
Right.
Right, but that's actually like what makes that interesting. Who was the name you just mentioned? Jonathan Peirce?
Charles Sanders Peirce.
Charles Sanders Peirce, yeah.
Because what makes that interesting is that that's a perfectly cogent explanation for people's experiences of religion. Where people say that they pray and things happen along those lines, like symbolic information, and that explains all of that in a really easy to understand, scientifically satisfying way.
No, for sure. Like within the mystic tradition, there's sort of talks. There's those saints that have talked about how they sort of see the entire world under a sacramental lens, where they basically, like, a sacrament is typically understood as like a visible sign of the unseen occurrences, like of God.
Yeah, they're just ripping off Proclus.
Yeah, there you go.
Look, that's the other thing you realize, and maybe this is a good place to end. I mean, you also realize that, like, look, a lot of what people think is Christian is just like a Christian thing painted on, an ancient Platonic idea, and you can take the Christian thing off, and what's underneath is different, right? It's not the same, but yeah, that sacramental lens, that's Proclus's notion of symbols, right? And because that's what they picked up, right? So there you go.
Yeah.
Cool. There you go, Johnny.
That was great.
All right. Yeah, great to talk with you guys.
Yeah, this was a great conversation. This was really, really interesting. 2 hours, right on the nose.
Nice. All right, I am ending the broadcast. You want to say anything, Craig?
I want to say, so we are wrapping up. We had 2 hours of the foremost philosopher in the atheist community yet today. You know, a lot of you guys out there like Graham Oppie, give me a break. You know,
he's a good guy. I like that guy.
Give me a break. He's not going to tell us about transhumanism and, like, come on. He'll keep us on, like, God. All he talks about is God. We said that's it. No, it was a great conversation. We covered a lot of ground, and we got a really thorough, we poked a hole. We peered into under a lot of tarps and found, covered a lot of interesting little topics there for your edification. So with that, we will say goodbye to our new favorite philosopher in the atheist community. And we will wrap her up.
Thank you very much for having me on. It's great to